Good morning, and welcome to the First Existentialist Congregation of Atlanta. We are a philosophically based spiritual community founded on existential philosophy and feminist principles and dedicated to human liberation and the protection of the natural world. My name is Patton White, and I will be facilitating this morning's Sunday celebration of life. We make our spiritual home in the old stone church, which was hand-built by the African-American Antioch East Baptist Church. We acknowledge that racial hostility drove those African-Americans from the area, and we honor them and the powerful history of this place. We also acknowledge that in the 1800s, the Muskogee Creek people were driven from this land, and we support justice for all indigenous people. Our opening words today are a poem by James Baldwin, who will be the focus of today's talk by our speaker, Dr. Robert Baker. This poem is entitled The Giver, and in parentheses, For Burdus, by James Baldwin. If the hope of giving is to love the living, the giver risks madness in the act of giving. Some such lesson I seemed to see in the faces that surrounded me. Needy and blind, unhopeful, unlifted, what gift would give them the gift to be gifted? The giver is no less adrift than those who are clamoring for the gift. If they cannot claim it, if it is not there, if their empty fingers beat the empty air, and the giver goes down on his knees in prayer, knows that all of his giving has been for naught, and that nothing was ever what he thought, and turns in his guilty bed to stare at the starving multitudes standing there, and rises from bed to curse at heaven, he must yet understand that to whom much is given, much will be taken, and justly so. I cannot tell how much I owe. Those words for me seem particularly relevant or resonant as we, as a world, see much strife and abuse of power, etc., etc. And I just would like to share that that at least my thoughts and prayers are with those in Ukraine at this moment. So today we have a familiar tune. It is the song that Aviva brought us many years ago, and it is the song called Let It Be, but it's not the other Let It Be. It's the Aviva Let It Be, although I don't think she composed it, but anyway, it's one of those songs that she will guide us through with the words, and so I urge you to rise and body your spirit as you are willing and able, and to let it be.
Okay, so this song that we are going to do is by Ricky Byers Beckworth. It's called Let It Be. Just let it be. And so you can do some arm movements with this song. We're going to say, we let the something wash over us. We let it be. I think you'll really enjoy this 432 hertz string sound on my keyboard. So here we go. We let the love wash over us. We let it be. Again. We let the love wash over us. We let We let the peace wash over us. We let it be. We let the peace wash over us. Feel free to harmonize. We let wash over us. We let it be. We let the joy wash over us. We let it be. Good connections. We let good connections wash over us. We let it be. We let good connections wash over us. We let We let the truth wash over us. We let it be. We let the truth wash over us. We let it be. wash over us. We let it be. We let it be.
Thank you so much, Aviva. I always love that song, and I look forward to being able to do it in person with everybody and with hearing all of the gorgeous harmonies that always occur during that song. Today's speaker is Dr. Robert Baker. H. Robert Baker is Associate Professor of History at Georgia State University and is the author of Prigg versus Pennsylvania, Slavery, the Supreme Court, and the Ambivalent Constitution, published in 2012, and The Rescue of Joshua Glover, A Fugitive Slave, the Constitution, and the Coming of the Civil War, published in 2006. His scholarly articles have appeared in the Law and History Review, Commonplace, and the Journal of Supreme Court History. He holds a PhD in history from UCLA, where he studied with Joyce Appleby. He has been a Fulbright Fellowship and been a Fellow at the Institute for Constitutional Studies. He also writes about wine, law, and contemporary culture for the blog Tropics of Meta. Please join me in welcoming Robert Baker.
I met James Baldwin in Europe, more specifically in Vienna in the winter of 1990. Astute observers will immediately note the obvious, the impossibility of this meeting. Baldwin, after all, lived in France and not in Austria. He died in St. Paul-de-Vence in the south of France in Cannes. He died in 1987, another inconvenient detail in the story of our meeting. In the winter of 1990, I was 16 and studying abroad. I have difficulty now describing my 16-year-old self. I was overweight, I had bad skin and bad hair. I bench pressed 300 pounds. I was the defensive lineman on the varsity football team, concertmaster of my school's orchestra. I read a lot, did well in school, and was prone to wild behavior. I was obnoxious in the way most teenagers are, or were back in the late 1980s. I certainly was not very interesting. But I did want to be a writer. I did enjoy music and the arts, and was vaguely aware that living in Tucson, Arizona was about as far from anything I enjoyed as I could get. When the opportunity arose to decamp to Europe for 6 months, I jumped. My host family was a family of 4 that occupied a 3-story flat in Hietzing. That's in the 13th Municipal District of Vienna, just west of the city center. In true apartment style, the 3 floors were accessed by a central stairway, and each story could be entirely closed off from the other. I lived on the first story in a dorm-like room, 5 by 10, with a single bed, a desk, a chair, and not much else. The 3rd floor was occupied by an elderly relative whom I never saw. I wasn't allowed on that floor. The 2nd floor featured the living quarters, kitchen, master suite, and an impressive balcony. But the highlight for me was the large library in the living room. My host father was an international lawyer and kept an impressive collection of German and English literature, much of it in collected editions with handsome bindings. But what attracted me was a shelf of paperback books with creased spines, fading colors, that rested just below eye level. Here were titles that I had never seen or heard of before. Some of them just to illustrate: The Autobiography of Malcolm X, Necessities of Life, poems by Adrienne Rich, and Nobody Knows My Name by James Baldwin. One day, my host father returned from work to find me on the Davenport reading the Autobiography of Malcolm X. He was a handsome man with a Germanic nose, big blue eyes, and a pleasant if intense demeanor. He stopped, briefcase dangling at his side. He asked me if that book was from his library. I told him it was. I paused a beat, realizing I had not asked permission to go into his library. "Is it okay if I read them?" I asked. "Oh yes," he told me, "but please be careful. Those are fragile books. They have great sentimental value." He stopped and thought about it a second. When I was in New York at NYU in the 1960s, he told me, this is where he went to law school, this was what we read and what we talked about. He gave me a fatherly smile and passed on to the kitchen. We don't stop sometimes to think about the strange passage of ideas in our world. As a high school junior living in Tucson, Arizona, I had never had occasion to read James Baldwin or Malcolm X or, for that matter, any of the public intellectuals of the 1960s. I had to travel to Vienna to come face to face with them, and then in the form of paperbacks sold at some Greenwich Village bookstore for $1.95 in 1963 or 4 to students who could barely afford cans of beans and winter coats. And this was how I met James Baldwin, through an Austrian lawyer who had a Tony flat in Vienna. Finding Baldwin was special. I was first attracted to an essay in his 1961 collection, No One Knows My Name, entitled Faulkner and Desegregation. At the time, I was reading William Faulkner's stunning As I Lay Dying, and I had attempted on my own to crack Absalom, Absalom. Everything about Faulkner fascinated me, the rhythm of his prose, the emotional depth of his characters, and the complex ways that plot seemed to disintegrate man's tidy notions of right and wrong, black and white. And so, to spot an essay with the word Faulkner in the title spurred my interest. I didn't know what Faulkner had to do with desegregation, but never mind. I plowed straight ahead. The essay was a searing indictment of William Faulkner's stance on desegregation, which he had adopted after Brown v. Board of Education was decided in 1954. William Faulkner, like most educated Southern white folk, simultaneously condemned segregation, but exhorted the rest of the country, and especially the federal government, to stay out of the South's affairs. "Leave us alone," he more or less said, "and we'll take care of this ourselves." I hadn't known prior to reading the essay that Faulkner had even had a stance on desegregation. Baldwin carefully took apart Faulkner's argument, detailing its contradictions, its logical fallacies, its failure to confront mounds of historical evidence. It was an utterly convincing takedown. But what impressed me most was Baldwin's sensitivity with his opponent. He had to know that he was taking on what might be America's most celebrated literary author, apologies to Ernest Hemingway. Faulkner wasn't just a heavyweight. He wasn't just a champ. He was the greatest of all time. To climb into the ring with Faulkner, especially as a young author, Baldwin was 35 or so at the time he wrote the essay, must have been daunting. And Baldwin pulled no punches and showed little in the way of mercy. Faulkner advised everyone to go slow. Baldwin quoted Thurgood Marshall back at him. "When they say go slow, they mean don't go." Faulkner suggested that Southerners would change segregation, which Faulkner knew looked silly to the rest of the world, if Southerners were just left to their own devices. Baldwin cited 100 years of history to show just how much white Southerners had invested in their silly system. Faulkner complained that extremists on both sides were pulling all the oxygen from the room, leaving middle-of-the-road people like himself with no options. Baldwin patiently described how the NAACP and the White Citizens Councils, created to resist desegregation by bullying, intimidation, and even violence, could not be placed on the same plane. But what struck me then, and even more so now, was not Baldwin's steady jabs and punishing crosses and hooks. It was instead the way he moved in the ring, confronting Faulkner's many contradictory statements regarding desegregation, which Faulkner had given in multiple interviews to multiple magazines. Baldwin did not go for the cheap shot of calling Faulkner incoherent or intellectually dishonest. Instead, he offered a more perceptive take. "Faulkner means everything he says, means them all at once, and with very nearly the same intensity," said Baldwin. "This is why his statements demand our attention. He has perhaps never before more concretely expressed what it means to be a Southerner." By which Baldwin meant that educated Southerners could simultaneously recognize the injustice of segregation, desire its change, reject outside interference on behalf of Southern black people, and actively work against desegregation. Contradictions such as these are present in all of our politics, today no less so than the 1960s. Understanding them requires more than just a sense of justice or righteousness. It calls for nuance and then clarity. Of course, Baldwin's generosity had limits. Faulkner might be accorded respect, but few can forget how he dismantled William F. Buckley in a debate before the Cambridge Union in 1965. Again, we have two heavyweights in the ring, one a paragon of conservatism, the other a startling black progressive. If you haven't watched the debate, you should. You can find it on YouTube. One would think that the Cambridge Union, a decidedly blue blood organization with claims on being the conservator, or at least one of the conservators, of Western civilization, might not be the friendliest venue for someone like Baldwin. But Baldwin won the debate handily, at times giving the perspective of the sensitive artist, at times fulminating like a Jeremiah. As skilled as William F. Buckley was, he didn't stand a chance. By then, though, few did. Baldwin was not only larger than life by 1965, he had assumed a role as the intellectual voice of the radicals. Now, to be clear, this meant something specific in 1960 and 1965 that it does not mean today. In 1960, the radicals were the university students, and the students had decided that they wanted to overturn the old order. They chafed at universities, who forbade them to leave campus unless they obtained permission. They rejected demands to stay safe and let the lawyers handle things while they studied. And most famously, they threw aside an older generation that was, like Faulkner, still patient with the slow progress of change. These radicals took to the streets to demand their rights. These were the students who did not just march, but really put their bodies on the line. They sat down at lunch counters that would not serve them. They boycotted department stores that took their money, but made them use service entrances. They led voter registration drives that tested federal desegregation orders in places like Alabama and Mississippi. They suffered jail, beatings, dogs, fire hoses, lynchings. They were radical, and they were right. Baldwin had by then left the comfort of Europe to play his part in the struggle. He was one of the black leaders who had met with the Attorney General Bobby Kennedy shortly after John F. Kennedy assumed the office of the presidency. The Kennedys had positioned themselves as sympathetic to civil rights and as allies. And Bobby Kennedy's meeting with black leaders was meant to facilitate, or perhaps to palliate. Bobby expected respect and gratitude. Instead, he got a lecture from Baldwin so severe that he immediately flagged Baldwin for domestic surveillance by the FBI. Baldwin was as deep in the struggle and just as self-assured of the righteousness of his cause and of the injustice of the go slow crowd as any other member of the civil rights movement. And against impending counterinsurgency by segregationists and their ambivalent national allies, Baldwin used his decisive prose over and over again to reveal the flaws in their thinking. In this respect, it is easy to miss the profound effect that arguments like Baldwin's had on conservative intellectuals. Take William F. Buckley. In 1955, William F. Buckley's National Review had cautiously endorsed segregation, at least on a temporary basis, as the only practical short-term solution to the Southern race problem. When Buckley held his storied debate with Baldwin in the Cambridge Union a decade later, that's in 1965, Buckley made no attempt to defend segregation at all, particularly in the face of Baldwin's withering arguments. His defense of the United States and the United States dream was the defense of an aspirational United States that was prosperous and had done a far better job than socialist governments in pulling people out of poverty. He wanted segregation abolished and a moral reformation, just not one conducted by government fiat. In short, conservative intellectuals had been retreating from their principal positions for a decade against an advancing phalanx of civil rights leaders. James Baldwin had assumed his place in the front ranks. It was in this sense that Baldwin was a radical. He had exposed the middle-of-the-road position, the moderate or centrist position, as untenable. Whether he was outmaneuvering William Faulkner or outslugging William F. Buckley, he was exhorting Americans that they were going to have to make a choice, and that segregation must either entirely fall or entirely continue. There was no middle road. Baldwin's solidarity with other black leaders was real, but he was never a party man or made to toe the line. Where Baldwin found dangerous arguments, he exposed them. When Malcolm X made headlines preaching about white devils and extolling black people as superior to white, Baldwin called him out. One of his most famous essays was The Fire Next Time. It was Baldwin's reflections on his own spiritual journey, and more importantly on the quick rise of the Nation of Islam. The essay concluded with Baldwin's description of a meeting with Elijah Muhammad, the founder of the Nation of Islam, in his South Side Chicago mansion. The Fire Next Time was and is a tour de force. It revealed in starkly personal terms the torment of a writer who had inveighed against injustice in American society, who had called out white liberals who were too timid to advocate for real change, and who now had to face down black allies who were making starkly racist and illiberal claims. And so, James Baldwin visited Elijah Muhammad. He broke bread with Elijah and his disciples, and listened to Elijah Muhammad explain that all white people were devils, that God had fixed them for annihilation, and had only spared the United States because of the presence of black people. Baldwin, who had spent much of his public life excoriating the complacent white population of America, recounted his experience this way. And I looked around the table. I certainly had no evidence to give them that would outweigh Elijah's authority, or the evidence of their own lives, or the reality of the streets outside. Yes, I knew 2 or 3 people, white, whom I would trust with my life. And I knew a few others, white, who were struggling as hard as they knew how, and with great effort and sweat and risk, to make the world more human. But how could I say this? One cannot argue with anyone's experience or decision or belief. Baldwin's genius was to reveal the depths of his own ambivalence. Here were people with a shared lived experience who could not understand Baldwin's position, although he understood theirs and sympathized with it. Baldwin closed his essay with another almost heartbreaking admonition. It was time to leave, and we stood in the large living room saying goodnight, with everything curiously and heavily unresolved. I could not help feeling that I had failed a test, in their eyes and in my own, or that I had failed to heed a warning. Elijah and I shook hands, and he asked me where I was going. Wherever it was, I would be driven there. Because when we invite someone here, he said, we take the responsibility of protecting him from the white devils until he gets wherever it is he is going. I was, in fact, going to have a drink with several white devils on the other side of town. I confess that for a fraction of a second I hesitated to give the address, the kind of address that in Chicago, as in all American cities, identifies itself as a white address by virtue of its location. But I did give it, and Elijah and I walked out onto the steps, and one of the young men vanished to get the car. This was the James Baldwin who understood the painful weight of contradictions that we carry with us every day. Baldwin who perceived what it meant to be a human and a black man and an outcast and an intellectual. It took no small courage to do what Baldwin did, which was to thread the needle between social justice and human friendship. Something quite similar is on display when Baldwin hosted a talk featuring William Styron, who wrote The Confessions of Nat Turner, and Ozzie Davis, the outspoken actor and civil rights activist. Styron, a white Virginian, had written a compelling Pulitzer Prize-winning book, imagining what drove Nat Turner to lead what was the most successful slave rebellion in the United States. His book generated enormous criticism, some positive, but some decidedly negative. Ozzie Newsome arrived at the talk to condemn white America for refusing to let black men tell their own stories, for what we would today call appropriation, and most importantly, to condemn Hollywood's attempt to turn Styron's novel into a movie. William Styron was clearly wounded. A liberal himself, an ally to the civil rights movement, he was deeply hurt by the intimation that he had crossed a boundary. He defended his art the best he could, and James Baldwin gave him a fair summary, declaring that, in fact, both parties might be right, that it might be proper to argue simultaneously that Styron had written a wonderful book that rose to the level of art, and that, at the same time, it ought not to be the basis for the creation of mass entertainment, molded by a Hollywood that invariably sanitized and whitewashed its products. James Baldwin ended by declaring both Ozzie Davis and William Styron courageous men. It was a fantastic moment of generosity, Baldwin sitting between two friends, mediating a dispute that meant the world to both of them. Intellectual generosity is in short supply in our era of cable news and social media. We might do well to learn from James Baldwin. I've come a long way, chronologically speaking at least, in this talk, bouncing as I have from the 1960s to the 2020s. But I'm a long way from the 16-year-old boy that I was, sitting on the Davenport, reading James Baldwin in Vienna. So I'll return there to conclude. In Baldwin's essay collection, Nobody Knows My Name, is an article titled The Discovery of What It Means to Be an American. Baldwin confronts that question by telling the story of how he fled America for Europe, settled in Paris, and then confronted himself. He joined, of course, a noble and ancient tradition, ancient by American standards, as artists had been fleeing America for Europe since the 1920s. Baldwin fled America because of the race question, and one expects the essay to move consistently in this direction, dissecting race in the Old World and the New. But it does not. Instead, Baldwin reflects on how he felt being a writer and an artist in Europe. To be a writer in America, Baldwin said, was to feel constantly ill at ease. Once in Europe, he observed, the American writer is released from the necessity of apologizing for himself. Writers are who they are. They practice an established profession. They can feel secure as writers in Europe. Not so in America, which has always regarded its artists with an air of suspicion, a twist of the wrist to check a watch, and the incessant demand to know how much money is in that. To that 16-year-old boy, this came like a thunderbolt. I was a young, aspiring writer who at the time had trekked off to Europe not so much to find myself, but because it seemed better than languishing in the Arizona desert. But Baldwin had shocked me out of my own complacency, forced me to look inward and understand why I failed to embrace myself as a writer. James Baldwin seemed to be speaking directly to me. Of course, it is the conceit of every 16-year-old that every song, every poem, every novel is written just for him. I believed that then. I know now it's not true, and I make no apology for the conceit of youth. As Baldwin was arguing in his essay, to be young was to understand the possibility of becoming. For me, finding Baldwin was a way for me to embrace my own self, to trust my own voice, and to set aside the expectations and conceits of the outside world. Baldwin summed it up best. Though we do not wholly believe it yet, the interior life is a real life, and the intangible dreams of people have a tangible effect on the world.
Thank you, Rob, for those reflections on James Baldwin. Please join us on Zoom immediately following today's broadcast, where we will have a meet and greet, talk about what Robert Baker brought up in his remarks, as well as sharing personal joys, sorrows, and concerns, and community announcements. You can find the link for the Zoom meeting in the chat or comment section of today's broadcast. Next week, we will be back in person at the First Existentialist Congregation of Atlanta at 470 Candler Park Drive in the Old Stone Church for our 11 a.m. Sunday celebration of life. We hope to see you all back in person with us as we return almost exactly a year, or 2 years, I should say, after the beginning of lockdowns in 2020. Reverend Marty Keller will be welcoming us back into the space with her talk, Women and Persons of Valor, as we kick off Women's History Month. We will be doing our best to post recordings of portions of the service on our YouTube channel just as soon as we can. So if you cannot join us in person, watch for the recording on YouTube. And Robert will be sending out via his e-blast when things have been posted and how you can access that with a direct link. I sincerely hope that we will be able to remain in person and will not need to return to this virtual format for a while at least. But because this has become a familiar format for us as well, we know that we can easily pivot back to it if public health if the public health situation changes dramatically and it becomes necessary for us to do it again. But thank you so much for joining us today. I hope to see you on Zoom shortly or next week in person in our sanctuary. Until then, have a great rest of your day today, a great rest of your weekend, and the coming week ahead. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.